Ethan Carter had always believed that home was a sanctuary, a place to reclaim one's peace after years of life's battles. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan poured his heart into every corner of his modest suburban home. Nestled on a quiet tree-lined street, his house was not only a tribute to his past, but also a canvas for his passion, restoring classic cars in a small workshop behind the house. Every gleaming surface, every lovingly restored detail, told a story of resilience and commitment. On a crisp autumn afternoon, as golden lights slanted through the trees, Ethan was meticulously polishing the fender of a '57 Chevy when his reverie was shattered by the sound of determined footsteps. At his gate stood Kerren, self-appointed enforcer and the imperious president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. With her crisp blouse and perfectly coiffed hair, Kerren exuded an air of unassailable authority. Today, however, her eyes burned with an entitlement that threatened to upset the careful balance of Ethan's well-ordered life. "Mr. Carter," she announced, holding a thick envelope of printed notices, "I'm here to inform you that your property is in violation of the community standards." Her tone was clipped and final, as if every word were carved from stone. Ethan, accustomed to the neighborhood's unspoken rules, yet quietly questioning their fairness, listened with measured calm. Kerren's charge? His recently installed porch lights, which he claimed were excessively bright and utterly disruptive to the HOA's aesthetic. Ethan's heart sank, not because the lights themselves posed any harm, but because this was yet another example of arbitrary overreach. "Kerren, these lights are for safety and to highlight the beauty of the property," he explained, his voice steady despite the irritation building inside. "They're not harming anyone, nor do they break any code that I know of." Kerren's eyes narrowed. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. You agreed, by moving into this community, to abide by the standards we enforce." Her words, laced with superiority, left no room for discussion. For a moment, the suburban quiet was punctured only by the rustle of fallen leaves and the distant hum of life beyond. Inside, Ethan's mind raced. Memories of his military service flashed by, a time when following orders was paramount, yet fairness and honor had always been the bedrock of every decision. Now, in this peaceful retreat he'd fought so hard to secure, he faced an unwelcome authoritarianism. His home was meant to be a personal haven, not a stage for Kerren's self-righteous crusade. Even as the polite pleasantries of suburban life masked the brewing conflict, Ethan silently vowed that he would not allow this intrusion to stand. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it had begun. Kerren left with a curt nod and a promise that further inspections would follow if Ethan did not comply. As the door closed, Ethan stood for a long moment, porch light reflecting off his thoughtful gaze, knowing that this was only the first ripple in what would soon become a tidal wave of corruption and abuse of power. The seeds of resistance had been sown, and deep in his heart, Ethan understood that this battle would test not only his resolve, but also the very fabric of community justice. The following morning, Ethan's routine was shattered when he discovered a bright envelope taped to his front door. Inside, a fine of $750 for violating community light regulations glared at him in bold print. Shock and indignation warred within him. How could something as benign as porch lights be a violation? Yet Kerren's smug text, scribbled in her unmistakable haughty hand, left no ambiguity. The rules were absolute, and defiance was not an option. Outside, Kerren waited with arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk, as if she had already won. "I trust you understand that these fines are non-negotiable, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Ethan, however, wasn't about to submit to injustice. As a city official, he knew the local laws inside and out. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he replied evenly, his eyes never leaving hers. "These lights serve a public safety function and enhance the curb appeal of our neighborhood." Kerren's face contorted briefly in irritation before she masked it with arrogance. "Then you leave us no choice but to enforce the rules as they are written." Without waiting for further debate, she turned and strode down the block. Later that day, inspectors arrived at his doorstep with clipboards and stern expressions. They combed every inch of his property, measuring light levels, scrutinizing every modification, while Ethan patiently reiterated his points about safety and aesthetics. At the local zoning office, Ethan submitted all the evidence he had gathered, permits, safety reports, and even testimonials from neighbors who admired his tasteful enhancements. Yet, despite the clarity of his argument, whispers began to circulate among the inspectors. Could it be that the rules were being manipulated to serve Kerren's personal vendettas? Even as Ethan defended himself with calm precision, it was becoming evident that the HOA's power was being wielded not for communal benefit, but for personal retribution. Later that afternoon, as Ethan pored over municipal guidelines in his study, he realized this was no isolated incident. Kerren's unwavering insistence on a literal interpretation of obscure rules, and her willingness to impose steep fines for minor deviations, revealed an agenda far beyond mere community upkeep. It was a power play, an effort to keep everyone in line by using fear and intimidation as tools. The first power move by the HOA was a warning, a demonstration of authority meant to crush any hint of defiance. Ethan's protest wasn't just about porch lights. It was about reclaiming the dignity of a community that was slowly succumbing to tyranny. In the quiet hours of that turbulent evening, Ethan's resolve crystallized. He would not be bullied by Kerren's inflated sense of self-importance. With every document he filed and every conversation he initiated with fellow homeowners, he laid the groundwork for a challenge that would expose the crooked foundations of the HOA's authority. As days turned into weeks, the situation spiraled beyond a mere dispute over porch lights. Kerren's tactics grew increasingly audacious and illegal. Rumors swirled among the neighbors about a series of false violations levied on those who dared question the HOA's practices. One evening, while Ethan reviewed the mounting fines on his kitchen table, a nervous knock came at his door. It was a longtime neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, her eyes wide with worry. "They're saying you've been parking your car wrong, Mr. Carter," she whispered, trembling. "I heard Kerren is planning something big." Ethan's pulse quickened. The conversation confirmed what he had long suspected. The HOA was no longer about maintaining community standards, but about intimidating dissent. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Ethan began his own investigation. Quiet conversations with several residents revealed a hidden undercurrent of corruption. Homeowners spoke in hushed tones about sudden fines that mysteriously vanished if certain donations were made to the HOA fund, and how board members who questioned Kerren's methods were promptly sidelined. Late one night, as rain tapped against his window, a knock came from the side of his house. A nervous young man in a faded blazer, one of the HOA board members, slipped inside. "I can't keep quiet any longer," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder. "Kerren's been siphoning off HOA funds for her personal expenses. I've seen records, receipts, everything." With trembling hands, he passed Ethan a stack of documents, proof of misallocated funds, and a trail of fraudulent expenses. The evidence was damning. Armed with this insider information, Ethan set up discreet cameras around his property. Every unexpected visit from inspectors, every cryptic call from the HOA office was documented. Meanwhile, Kerren's tactics escalated. Notices threatening eviction and even hints at property seizure began appearing on neighbors' doors. The tension in the community reached a boiling point. Many homeowners, long cowed by Kerren's unyielding rule, found themselves questioning if the cost of compliance was too high. In hushed gatherings at backyard barbecues and quiet evenings on front porches, residents compared notes and shared stories of inexplicable fines and arbitrary inspections. The once friendly community was slowly uniting behind Ethan, galvanized by the knowledge that they were all being manipulated by a single, self-serving individual. For the first time, a sense of collective defiance began to take root. Ethan's investigative efforts took on a dual purpose: to defend his own rights and to expose a web of corruption that had ensnared his neighbors. Every night, by the dim light of his desk lamp, he pored over records and cross-referenced municipal codes. He knew that one well-documented misstep could be enough to bring Kerren's empire of intimidation crashing down. And as the evidence mounted, So did the whispers of rebellion throughout the neighborhood. One chilly morning, Ethan awoke to a scene that felt straight out of a nightmare. His driveway, once a symbol of the modest pride he took in his home, was now marred by deep, jagged gouges in the asphalt. A hastily posted notice claimed that the HOA was expanding sidewalks as part of a new beautification project. But Ethan knew the truth. It was yet another pretext for the HOA to flex its power and punish him for defying Kerren's arbitrary rules. Determined not to be cowed, Ethan gathered his meticulously collected evidence and legal documents. That evening, he attended the monthly HOA meeting, a packed room buzzing with tension. As Kerren took her usual position at the front, her eyes flickered with uncertainty when she saw the thick file Ethan carried. With a steady voice, he began outlining every misstep, every violation of proper procedure, and every instance of financial misconduct that he had uncovered. He projected charts of misallocated funds, presented sworn statements from shaken neighbors, and even played a short clip from one of his security cameras that captured an unannounced, aggressive visit by an HOA inspector. The room fell into stunned silence as board members exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, Kerren's iron grip was visibly slipping. "These are serious allegations," a board member stuttered, his voice quivering with a mixture of fear and relief. But Kerren, visibly agitated yet desperate to retain control, tried to interject. "This is all a misunderstanding. Rules are in place for the benefit of everyone," she cried, though her words rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence. As the meeting progressed, more residents stood up and shared their own stories of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. A growing chorus of voices united in their demand for fairness and accountability. Even those who had long trembled under the weight of Kerren's decrees found courage in Ethan's example. The tide was turning. Public support surged, and murmurs of a collective uprising filled the room. Kerren's panic was palpable. In a final desperate attempt to silence him, she threatened legal action and warned that anyone opposing the HOA's decisions would face dire consequences. Yet, her bluster only deepened the resolve of the community. By the end of the meeting, several board members had voiced their support for Ethan's call for a thorough, independent investigation into the HOA's practices. The very foundations of Kerren's authority were cracking. Outside that night, as neighbors converged on Ethan's porch to discuss the day's events, the sense of empowerment was electric. For the first time in years, the community realized that their home and their freedom could no longer be dictated by one person's overzealous interpretation of rules. Ethan's act of defiance wasn't just a personal stand. It had become a beacon of hope for an entire neighborhood yearning for justice. Kerren's desperation reached a fever pitch. In a final bid to regain control, she decided to escalate matters by involving the police. One early evening, as dusk settled over the suburb, she made a call that would mark the beginning of her undoing, claiming that Ethan's brilliantly lit porch constituted a public disturbance and even damaged community property, a claim linking his modifications to a supposed dent in her meticulously maintained car parked outside her mansion. She summoned law enforcement to his doorstep. When the uniformed officers arrived, Ethan calmly greeted them. Flashing his city official badge, he explained the full context, how the lights were not only harmless, but actually in compliance with local safety codes. The officers exchanged puzzled glances as Kerren fumed in the background, her accusations growing more absurd by the minute. "This is nothing more than a personal vendetta," one officer remarked quietly to Ethan as they left the scene, leaving Kerren red-faced and frustrated. But Kerren wasn't finished. Determined to dig up dirt on Ethan and discredit his crusade, she secretly hired a private investigator. This PI was tasked with finding any inkling of impropriety in Ethan's past. Late one night, as Ethan reviewed some additional documents in his study, his security camera footage revealed a shadowy figure creeping around his garage. Reviewing the timestamps, Ethan recognized the man from a grainy video taken earlier, a man who was now caught on camera attempting to pry into his personal records. With a sinking feeling, Ethan realized the private investigator had overstepped legal boundaries by trespassing. Armed with this new evidence, Ethan prepared for the next HOA meeting. When the day arrived, he played the security footage for the entire assembly. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs of outrage as the incriminating images showed the PI skulking around his property. The collective realization was stark. Kerren had stooped so low as to employ illegal surveillance and trespass against a law-abiding homeowner. Kerren's final move backfired spectacularly. As residents absorbed the damning evidence, board members began questioning not only her authority, but her very ethics. "How can we trust someone who resorts to illegal means?" one neighbor demanded. The backlash was swift and brutal. What had begun as a personal vendetta now exposed a web of corruption that implicated not just Kerren, but the very system she represented. Realizing that her hold over the community was unraveling, Kerren attempted one last diatribe, her voice cracking as she insisted that she was simply enforcing the rules. But the damage was done. The evidence of illegal conduct and the widespread support for Ethan left no room for her defenses. In that charged moment, the seeds of her downfall were irrevocably sown. In the weeks that followed, the community's collective outrage transformed into action. Fueled by Ethan's steadfast leadership and the mounting evidence against Kerren, a coalition of homeowners formed. They petitioned for an independent investigation into the HOA's practices and demanded accountability from every board member complicit in the corruption. As the investigation unfolded, the truth emerged like a tidal wave. Kerren had not only manipulated fines, but had also diverted HOA funds for personal gain. Under mounting public pressure and facing the prospect of criminal charges, Kerren's reign of terror came to an abrupt end. In a dramatic vote at a special meeting convened by the disgruntled homeowners, Kerren was unseated from the board. Her removal was accompanied by a cascade of fines levied against the HOA itself for its abusive practices. The city, now alerted to the systemic corruption, launched its own review of the association's operations. Within days, the HOA's credibility was in ruins, and Kerren's personal assets were put under scrutiny. As news of Kerren's downfall spread through the neighborhood, residents felt a renewed sense of empowerment. Ethan, who had long maintained a dignified silence in the face of injustice, now found himself at the center of a triumphant movement. Neighbors gathered on his well-lit porch, once the target of baseless fines, to celebrate their reclaimed freedom. In the midst of the jubilant atmosphere, Ethan quietly sipped his coffee, a subtle smile playing on his lips as he witnessed the collapse of a system built on fear and intimidation. Kerren's mansion, once a symbol of her self-appointed superiority, was forced onto the market overnight. The very structure that had housed her authoritarian ambitions now stood as a monument to public humiliation. With her reputation in tatters and legal troubles looming, Kerren was left with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. The community, united by their shared struggle, vowed never again to let one individual's unchecked power dictate the terms of their lives. As the dust settled, the legal repercussions for the HOA became unavoidable. The city's investigation culminated in a series of heavy fines levied against the association, and several board members found themselves facing legal action for their roles in the corruption. Ethan led a coordinated effort, advising neighbors on filing a class action lawsuit that would finally hold the crooked system accountable. With every legal document and press conference, the community's confidence grew, and the full extent of the abuse was laid bare for all to see. In a decisive moment that underscored the community's resilience, the state authorities announced that the HOA would be dissolved entirely. The ruling not only vindicated Ethan's claims, but also signaled a new era of transparency and accountability for all local associations. In what many dubbed the final power move against Kerren, Ethan presented a comprehensive report, meticulously compiled from public records and first-hand testimonies, that left no room for doubt. The HOA had operated in blatant violation of local laws, and its dissolution was inevitable. Kerren's personal life soon mirrored the public collapse of her authority. The relentless scrutiny took its toll. Her car was repossessed amid allegations of misused funds. Her marriage disintegrated under the weight of public scandal. And even the few remaining allies she once counted on distanced themselves as the full extent of her misdeeds came to light. In a final humiliating twist of poetic justice, Word spread that Kerren had been hired, ironically, as an assistant property manager for another HOA, forced to reckon with the very rules she had once manipulated at will. Ethan, though never one to revel in another's misfortune, couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. Each news headline, each whispered comment in the neighborhood, confirmed that accountability had finally caught up with the self-styled enforcer. The downfall of Kerren was not just a personal loss. It was a victory for every homeowner who had suffered under the oppressive, arbitrary regulations she championed. Weeks later, the neighborhood had transformed. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and constant surveillance had lifted, replaced by a spirit of unity and reclaimed independence. Ethan's porch, once the focal point of Kerren's baseless accusations, had become a gathering place for neighbors, a symbol of community resilience and the triumph of fairness over tyranny. One sunny afternoon, as Ethan relaxed with a well-earned cup of coffee, a neighbor strolled by carrying a playful prop, a faux HOA violation notice humorously citing excessive optimism or unruly porch decor. The crowd burst into laughter. Ethan's eyes twinkled with mirth and quiet vindication. "They really tried," he murmured, his tone equal parts amusement and relief. In that final light-hearted moment, the lasting legacy of the struggle became clear. What began as a battle over simple porch lights had evolved into a powerful lesson. When a community unites against corruption, no tyrant, no matter how entitled, can stand in the way of justice. The camera panned out on the friendly, liberated neighborhood, where every smile and shared laugh was a resounding mic drop on the era of abuse. Fade to black.